He thought the mansion would swallow her. He didn't know it had been waiting 30 years for somebody smart enough to notice it was still breathing. Victor Romano handed Elena Moretti a key and called it an exile. He never once asked why a house nobody wanted was the one thing his family had never let anyone sell. She was 27 and she had no army, no name in the city that meant anything, and no one left to call if this went wrong. What she had was a folder of numbers that didn't add up, and the particular, dangerous patience of someone who had learned to wait. What Victor did not know, what none of the men standing behind him with their hands folded and their eyes hidden knew, was that the mansion had been keeping a secret since before he was born. A secret older than his father's empire. A secret that was, as of tonight, no longer only his. Elena had not been raised to survive men like Victor Romano. She had been raised to survive the people who worked for men like Victor Romano, which, it turned out, was harder. Her father had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant, the kind companies hired when they needed to know exactly how much had gone missing and whose hands it had passed through. He didn't believe in instinct. He believed in the ledger. People lie with their mouths, he used to say, red pen in hand at the kitchen table while she did her homework beside his spreadsheets. Numbers only lie when somebody teaches them how. Your job is to notice who's been giving the lessons. He taught her to read a balance sheet before she could read a novel. He taught her that a shell company has a shape, the way a lie has a shape, if you know where the seams are supposed to be. He died when she was 25, a fall officially. And Elena stopped believing unofficially somewhere around the time she started quietly reconciling the books of 3 companies that on paper shared nothing but underneath fed the same account. The account belonged to Victor Romano. She never confronted him. She never sold what she knew, never let a single person guess she had it. She simply kept learning, patient and exact, the way her father had taught her, until the night his people found out anyway. Victor did not order her killed. A woman found dead with financial records connecting her to his organization would have raised exactly the kind of questions he'd spent a decade making sure never got asked. Killing her was clumsy. Victor didn't do clumsy. So he did the other thing men like him do when a problem is too clean to bury and too dangerous to ignore. He buried it in plain sight. He gave her a house. The estate sat outside the city on land nobody had wanted in a generation. An enormous, decaying mansion the locals called cursed, its gardens gone feral, half its windows dark behind wrought iron. People only mentioned it to explain why land nearby sold cheap. Victor met her at the gates himself, which should have told her something. Men only disposing of a nuisance don't usually come in person. He wore a pale gray, black shirt beneath it, the kind of restraint that costs more than showing off does. Behind him, his car waited, long and black, engine still ticking with heat. Behind that stood his men, Marco upright in watchful loyalty built on discipline rather than affection. Dante's silent hands loose in the particular way of a man who has never needed to hurry, and Leo youngest of the 3. A half step back watching Elena with an attention that had nothing to do with orders. Victor held the key out between 2 fingers like a verdict. It's yours. His voice was pleasant, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. Consider it a courtesy, somewhere quiet, somewhere you can disappear without anyone having to make it complicated. Elena looked at the key first, then past his shoulder at the mansion, rising gray and enormous against the last light. The sealed lower windows on the east wing, oddly placed for a house that size, and a service road half swallowed by weeds that curved away from the main drive towards something the front of the house didn't explain. She had spent 3 years reading things men like Victor Romano didn't want read. She wasn't going to stop just because the ledger had turned into a building. "Thank you," she said, and closed her fingers around the key. Victor smiled. The smile of a man who believes a problem has just solved itself, and turned back toward the car. Marco opened the door for him without being asked. Dante didn't move at all. Leo's eyes stayed on Elena a second too long before he followed. Victor didn't see her look back at the mansion once the gates had shut between them. He didn't see the exact moment her expression stopped being exile and became something closer to inventory. The gates groaned as she pushed them the rest of the way open herself, iron dragging a rusted seam through the gravel. The drive beyond was barely a drive anymore. Weeds through the stone, saplings pushing up where a fountain must once have stood. The mansion loomed closer with every step, 3 stories of dark windows and water-stained stone, a house built by people who'd wanted to be seen and left to rot by people who'd wanted it forgotten. Inside, the air was cold and close, thick with dust and the particular silence of a building that has stopped expecting visitors. Elena moved through the entrance hall slowly, letting her eyes adjust, cataloging the way her father had taught her to catalog anything, structural, not sentimental. Water damage there, a staircase that still looked sound, a hallway leading toward what should have been a servant's wing, except the proportions were wrong, too long for what it appeared to serve. She found the library at the back of the house, its shelves intact where everything else had failed, the roof above it somehow tighter than the rest. She set her bag down in the corner and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the house settle around her the way old houses do, creaks and shifts that sound almost like breathing. A hand found the edge of the nearest shelf, old oak, expertly joined, matching the others in every visible way. Except it didn't sound the same when she knocked on it. The rest of the wall gave back a dull, solid thud. This section answered hollow. Elena just found the first crack in a house built to hide something bigger than dust and broken windows. If you think Victor made a mistake tonight, comment Katie's below and tell us where you're watching from. Follow so you don't miss what's waiting behind that wall in Chapter 2. The hollow sound stayed with her longer than it should have. Elena pressed her palm flat against the shelf again, then against the section beside it, checking the difference wasn't imagination. It wasn't. But it was late. The library had gone the color of ash with the last of the daylight, and even her father's patience had rules. Note it. Don't chase it in the dark, he'd have said. So she did. Pulled a small notebook from her bag, sketched the wall, marked the section, and left it for morning. The rest of the house was still waiting to be read. She took the lamp oil she'd bought in town and moved room to room cataloging rather than wandering the way she'd have moved through a set of financial statements. Start at the top, work down. Note every irregularity before drawing conclusions. The entrance hall's staircase groaned, but didn't give. The grand salon had lost half its ceiling to water and gained a colony of ivy that had found its way in through a broken window and simply kept growing pale and leafless in the dark, threading across a chandelier that had crashed to the floor sometime in the last decade and never been cleared. Faded portraits lined the upper hall, their subjects unreadable beneath decades of grime. Men in old-fashioned suits, a woman with sharp eyes that seemed to track Elena's lamp as she passed. The dust here didn't move like ordinary dust. It sat undisturbed in thick gray sheets over furniture nobody had bothered to take when they left. A dining table set for a meal no one had eaten. Chairs pushed back as if the guests had simply stood and walked out. It should have frightened her. A 27-year-old woman, alone, in a 3-story tomb, miles from anyone who'd notice if she screamed. Instead, Elena found herself doing what she always did when a situation refused to make sense, breaking it into columns. Sound structure, failing structure, a failing structure, explainable, unexplainable. The east wing's roofline sagged, but the walls beneath it were dry. Someone had reinforced the foundation there and recently enough that the work didn't match the rest of the house's neglect. The kitchen and what had once been the servants' quarters sat below ground level at the rear, colder than they should have been for the season air moving through them in a way that meant somewhere. Some passage led outside that wasn't a door. 2 of the ground floor entrances were usable. A third, on the north face, had been bricked over from the inside, not collapsed. Bricked. Deliberately. By the time she'd worked halfway through the ground floor, the mansion had stopped being a threat and become a puzzle instead. And Elena did not know how to stay afraid of a puzzle. 40 minutes outside the city, Victor Romano sat in the back of his car and thought about nothing at all, which was, for him, its own kind of satisfaction. Should we keep eyes on her? Marco asked from the front seat, watching the mansion shrink in the side mirror. Even loosely, just to know if she moves. Moves where? Victor didn't look up from his phone. She has no money beyond whatever's in that account of hers, which isn't much. No family. No one in this city who'll take her call. The estate's 3 hours from anything by road that isn't Holverton's back lanes, and she has no car. He said it the way he said most things, as an arithmetic problem already solved. She'll last a season, maybe 2. Then she'll sell the land to whoever's fool enough to buy it, or she'll rot out there alone until she gives up and comes crawling back for the annuity increase. Either way, she stops being my problem. Dante, beside Marco, said nothing, which was ordinary for Dante. Leo, in the back beside Victor, said nothing too, but for a different reason. He was still seeing her face, not at the moment she'd taken the key. That part had gone the way Victor expected. Calm, unreadable. A woman accepting terms she couldn't refuse. It was the moment after, when Victor had turned to leave and Elena had looked past all of them, past the car, past the gates, straight at the house itself. And something in her expression had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Leo had grown up around frightened people. He knew what fear looked like on a face in the exact second it arrived. That hadn't been it. That had been the look of someone doing math. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that Victor would believe, and even less that Victor would want to hear. But he filed it away the way Elena, 3 hours behind them in the dark, was filing away the hollow wall in her library. She found the basement stairs just before midnight, mostly because she wasn't ready to sleep yet, and the notebook in her bag felt like unfinished business. The stonework down here was older than the house above it. Rougher, darker, laid by different hands in a different century. Most of it was consistent, but along the eastern wall, behind a stack of collapsed shelving that had once held wine, one section of stone sat slightly proud of the rest, its mortar a shade lighter, newer by decades if not longer. Elena cleared the debris carefully, quietly, and found, half buried in old dust, an iron ring set flush into the stone, the kind meant to be gripped and pulled, worn smooth by hands that weren't hers. She didn't pull it. Whatever this was, it had waited this long. It could wait until she understood what she was opening before she opened it. She sketched the wall's position instead, noted the ring's placement, the mortar's color, the shelving that had clearly been arranged to hide it. Arranged, not collapsed by accident, she was fairly sure now, and closed the notebook. She was halfway back up the stairs when she heard the footsteps. Soft, even. Somewhere above her, in the corridor near the portraits. She stood absolutely still, lamp lowered, listening until her own pulse was the loudest thing in the house. Nothing. She climbed the rest of the stairs slowly and checked the corridor. Empty. Dust undisturbed except by her own earlier passage. Except one door. The one she'd found closed an hour before at the far end of the servants' hall was now open by a few inches dark beyond it. Elena pushed it wider with 2 fingers. Inside was a small, forgotten study. A desk, a single chair, and on the wall, a photograph gone the color of tea. Its glass cracked in one corner. Several men stood in front of the mansion's gates, decades younger than the house looked now. One with a stance and a jaw she recognized immediately from newer photographs she'd copied out of financial filings years ago. An older Romano. She lifted the photograph carefully off its nail and turned it over. Faded ink. A hand not her own, waited on the back. The house remembers what the city forgets. Marco just told Victor the truth out loud. She isn't afraid, and that's the problem. Comment Bleak House if you think Elena has already won, and tell us who you're rooting for. Follow now. The siege is coming, and Chapter 6 changes everything. Elena read the line 3 times before she set the photograph down on the desk, face up, and made herself breathe the way her father had taught her to breathe over a set of books that didn't balance. Not with fear. With attention. She didn't sleep much that night. By the time gray light came through the one clean window of the library, she had already decided the house wasn't going to be read room by room anymore. It was going to be read like a ledger, systematically, from the outside in until the pattern underneath it showed itself. She spent the morning doing exactly that. Behind a false panel in the old dining room, she found a compartment built into the wainscoting. Empty now, but shaped for something rectangular. Files, she thought, or a strongbox. In what had once been a study on the 2nd floor, she found a small brass plate screwed into the underside of a desk drawer, engraved with initials that matched no family she could place. The wine cellar off the kitchen had been sealed with a door far heavier than a cellar needed, its hinges oiled more recently than anything else in the house. And in 3 separate places, the library shelf, a door frame in the east wing, a stone lintel over the old servant's stair, she found the same small mark cut into the wood or stone. A simple geometric symbol she didn't recognize but which had clearly been placed on purpose by someone who wanted certain rooms known to certain people and invisible to everyone else. Her father used to say that architecture, like accounting, was a language people used when they didn't want to speak plainly. This house had a great deal it hadn't wanted to say out loud. By early afternoon, she was back in the basement, in front of the iron ring. This time, she pulled it. The stone gave with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than the wall itself. Hinges she couldn't see grinding, free of decades of rust. Behind it, a staircase descended into dark, that her lamp barely touched stone steps worn smooth in the center. In a way, the rest of the house's stonework wasn't, worn by feet, many of them, over a very long time. The air coming up from below was cold and still and carried a smell like old paper and older stone. She went down. The passage at the bottom opened into a network of rooms that had nothing to do with wine storage or servants' work. The first was long and low-ceiling, a heavy table still standing at its center, chairs arranged around it as though a meeting had been interrupted mid-sentence and simply never resumed. The second held iron rings set into the walls at intervals she didn't want to think too closely about. The third, smaller, drier than the others, its door reinforced with a strip of metal long gone to rust, held shelving. And on the shelving, books, ledgers, dozens of them, leather covers cracked, pages foxed with age but intact. Elena's pulse didn't spike so much as focus. She opened the nearest one carefully, lamp close, and understood within 4 pages that she was not looking at household accounts. Names, dates, payments recorded in a private shorthand she recognized instantly because she'd spent 3 years reading a version of the same code in Victor's own companies, numbers structured to obscure rather than record. Property transfers routed through parties who existed on paper and nowhere else, debts noted. And beside several entries, a single word she didn't need translated, settled. This wasn't a hideout. She understood that within the hour, working her way down the shelf by lamplight, her notebook filling faster than she could organize it. This had been neutral ground, a room where families who couldn't be seen together in the city had come to negotiate, to divide territory, to forgive debts or collect them. Decades before Victor Romano had ever held a gun, people had disappeared from these pages the way numbers disappear from a balance sheet when someone with the right access decides they should, and threaded through the entries again and again, a name that predated Victor's, an older Romano, the same jaw from the photograph upstairs, present at meeting after meeting, as though he'd been one of the architects of whatever arrangement this room existed to serve. Elena sat back against the cold stone wall and let herself understand the second half of what she was looking at. Victor's empire hadn't been built by Victor. It had been inherited from an older network whose full shape he had probably never seen because someone at some point had made very sure this room and everything in it stayed exactly where it was, buried hidden, kept from the one man who might have thought he had a right to it. Whoever had built this archive hadn't wanted it lost. They'd wanted it kept from Victor. She didn't hear Leo arrive until his voice reached the top of the basement stairs, low and careful. Elena. She climbed up fast enough to startle him, lamp still in hand, dust on her sleeves. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking like a man who'd talked himself into and out of coming here several times on the drive. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Neither should you, according to Victor." And yet, he glanced past her toward the basement stairs, then back. He's starting to ask questions. Nothing urgent yet. But he mentioned the estate twice this week, which for him is unusual. Someone told him lights have been on at night. Are you here to report that back to him? I'm here to tell you before he decides to look himself. Elena studied him for a moment. The careful way he stood, like a man aware he was standing somewhere he shouldn't be twice over. Why do you care what happens to me, Leo? You don't owe me anything. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. Because the day he gave you those keys, you didn't look at that house like a woman being punished. He met her eyes. You looked at it like you'd already won. I haven't been able to stop thinking about that since. Neither of them said anything else. He left the way he'd come, quick and quiet, back toward the main road before anyone could clock how long his car had been gone. Elena went back down into the dark. She found the second door an hour later past the archive room at the end of a passage she hadn't fully explored, smaller than the first. Its surface marked not with the plain geometric symbols she'd seen elsewhere in the house, but with something else entirely, the Romano family crest carved deep into the stone and beneath it, a lock far newer than anything else down here. Someone had wanted this room hidden, not from the world, from Victor himself. Elena stood in front of the second door for a long time before she made herself leave it closed. The crest cut into the stone was unmistakable. The same mark she'd seen reproduced smaller and cheaper on the cufflinks of men who worked for Victor. The same lines she'd traced 100 times in property filings and shell company letterheads. But this lock was newer than the room around it. Newer than the ledgers on the other shelves. Newer, she suspected, than Victor himself. Someone had come down here after the rest of the archive was already old and decided one door needed to stay shut even from the family it belonged to. She didn't force it. She made herself walk back up into the daylight instead. And somewhere on those stairs climbing out of that cold, buried room, she understood what she actually had. Not just information. Not just leverage over a man who thought he'd already won. She had a location no one was watching. That was the pot she'd been circling without naming it. 3 days of cataloging decay and coded ledgers, and the real value of the mansion had nothing to do with what was written on its walls. It was that nobody in the city expected anything to happen here at all. Victor had chosen this place because it was forgotten. He hadn't understood that forgotten and safe were, from a certain angle, the same word. The first visitor arrived 4 days later, on foot, having walked the last mile from where the bus line ended. He was younger than Elena expected, thin, wearing a coat too heavy for the weather because he'd clearly been sleeping in it. He stood at the gate for a long time before he worked up the nerve to call through the bars. And when Elena came out to meet him, he flinched like he expected her to already know why he'd come. "You're Elena Moretti." Not a question. "I did the quarterly filings for Adriano Holdings. I know what those numbers actually are. I know you know too." His hands were shaking. "I thought. I heard you had this place now and I didn't know where else." "You thought I'd sell you out to Victor," Elena said, "to buy myself back into his good graces." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. She opened the gate instead. She listened to him for 2 hours in what had been the dining room, sweeping dust off 2 chairs so they could sit across from each other like the meeting mattered, which it did. He told her things about Victor's current financial architecture that even her own 3 years of quiet reconciliation hadn't surfaced. New accounts, a shift in how payments to officials were being routed, a name she recognized from the ledgers underground, still active, still being paid. She didn't promise him revenge. She didn't promise him Victor would ever answer for anything. "You can stay," she told him instead, "as long as you need. Nothing happens to you here that you don't choose." That night, sitting by the library fire with a notebook, Elena wrote down 3 lines and understood, as she wrote them, that she was no longer simply hiding in a house Victor had given her to get rid of her. No violence inside these walls. No one who comes here for protection is ever handed back. No one who stays is asked to become a soldier. She wasn't building an army. She'd watched men build armies her whole life, watched what it cost the people underneath them. She was building the one thing Victor's world had never offered anyone, a room where the rules didn't bend for whoever held the most fear. Word moved slowly in places built to be forgotten, and then all at once. Within weeks, others came. A woman who'd driven for one of Victor's lieutenants and knew the back roads better than the man who'd fired her. A mechanic from the port district who'd fixed one too many cars with blood in the trunk and decided he was done. A retired security man who'd once, decades ago, worked this very estate and still remembered which floorboards had always creaked. None of them arrived as soldiers. All of them arrived as people who needed somewhere the fear didn't follow. With their help, quiet, unhurried, done at night when it wouldn't be seen from the road, the mansion began to change. Windows that had stood broken for a decade were glazed again. The gates were freed of rust and hung true on their hinges. Halls that had smelled of mildew for years began, slowly, to smell of wood smoke and clean stone instead. Portraits were taken down, cleaned, rehung. The chandelier that had lain shattered on the salon floor since before Elena arrived was replaced with something simpler, but it burned every night now along with every other light the house possessed. Because Elena had decided early on that a house pretending to be abandoned had served Victor's purposes and would never serve hers again. The underground passages were cleared last, carefully. The ledgers moved somewhere only Elena knew. Watching the house come back to itself felt, to her, uncomfortably like watching herself do the same thing. In the city, the rumors reached Victor the way rumors always did. Sideways, through people who didn't realize what they were telling him. Someone mentioned lights at the old estate. Someone else mentioned cars on the service road at night. A third source, more amused than concerned, said the abandoned Moretti property had visitors now, regular ones. Victor laughed the first time he heard it. genuinely laughed. A woman with no money and no name, playing house in a ruin he'd handed her as a courtesy. It struck him as almost sweet in the way small, doomed efforts sometimes did. He stopped laughing when Marco told him the rest of it. People are starting to ask permission before they go near the estate, Marco said, carefully, watching Victor's face rather than his own words. Not from us, from each other. Like there's a rule now, and nobody wants to be the one who breaks it first. Victor said nothing for a long moment. Marco remembered without wanting to the exact look on Elena's face the evening they'd left her at those gates. The way she'd looked past all of them at the house itself, calm in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He told himself at the time it was resignation. He was no longer sure that was what he'd seen. The crew that came for the estate 2 nights later hadn't heard the rumors or hadn't believed them. They came the way anyone comes for an easy target. 3 cars, no hurry, expecting a dark house and an unarmed woman. What they found instead, rounding the final bend in the service road, was a mansion, lit window to window, against the black hillside gates standing restored and closed. Every light in the house burning like it had never once been abandoned at all. The lead car slowed, then stopped. The others stopped behind it. No one got out. The driver leaned toward the man beside him, voice low, eyes still on the glowing windows. That's not an abandoned house anymore. The crew that turned back that night didn't stay quiet about it. Fear rarely does. By the time the story had passed through 2 more mouths, the mansion had a name it hadn't asked for, and would never shake. People stopped calling it the abandoned Moretti place and started calling it something else entirely. The Black House. Elena heard it first from Nico, who heard it from a supplier in the port district who swore he'd never go near the service road after dark. She heard it again a week later from Sophia, delivered with the dry amusement of a woman who'd spent 15 years reading contracts for a living and had opinions about branding. The rumors that came with the name were, almost without exception, wrong. People said Elena knew everyone's secrets. Not most people's. Everyone's. They said the tunnels beneath the mansion ran clear into the heart of the city, that Victor himself couldn't set foot past the gates without her permission, that anyone she chose to protect became, somehow, untouchable. They said the estate had become neutral ground the way certain churches once were, a place where old grudges simply stopped applying. None of it was entirely true. Most of it wasn't true at all. Elena let every word of it stand. She'd learned this from her father without either of them meaning to teach it. A number doesn't have to be accurate to change how people behave. It only has to be believed. Fear worked the same way. She had no army, no tunnels reaching the city, no real claim on Victor's obedience. But as long as no one could say for certain what she didn't have, the uncertainty did the work violence would otherwise have to do. She never corrected a rumor. She simply kept building the thing underneath it. The people who found their way to the Black House in those weeks weren't soldiers, and Elena made sure of it every time someone new arrived. Sofia Bellini came first among them to matter, a former legal clerk who'd spent a decade filing property transfers for a firm that quietly served half of Victor's holdings, until she'd seen one filing too many that didn't sit right and walked out with nothing but her coat and what she remembered. She understood the language of deeds and shell ownership the way Elena understood ledgers, and together they began cross-referencing what the underground archive held against what was still active in the city's public records. Rafael Costa arrived a week after her thin and wary former driver, who'd spent years learning every backroad checkpoint and blind turn between the estate and the harbor, and had finally decided he was done using that knowledge for Victor's convenience. Nico Ferraro showed up not seeking sanctuary at all, but with a truck full of salvaged parts and an offer to fix whatever needed fixing, and simply stay. Within a month, he'd become the reason the gates swung true and the generator ran without complaint. None of them called themselves soldiers. Elena wouldn't have allowed it if they had. They were, each in their own way, people who'd looked at the 2 available futures, kneeling to Victor or standing beside a woman who asked nothing but honesty and chosen the second one. Leo came less often than the others, and always alone, and always at hours when his absence wouldn't be noticed. He didn't bring news every time. Sometimes he simply sat in the restored library while Elena worked, the fire low, saying little. But when there was something worth saying, a shipment rerouted a name Victor had mentioned with unusual interest, a growing unease among men who'd started asking each other quiet questions about the estate. He brought it to her plainly without asking anything in return. Elena never pushed him toward more than that. Whatever this was between them, it wasn't built on anything either of them had said aloud, and she was careful not to make it cost him more than he already risked simply by driving out here in the dark. It was Sophia who found the pattern that mattered most, working through the deepest shelf of the underground archive. Documents Elena had deliberately left for last, sensing without knowing why that they held more weight than the rest. They found agreements bearing signatures that made Sophia go very still. Men who now stood at Victor's right hand, men whose loyalty he treated as fact rather than arrangement, had once made private agreements with Victor's father, decades before Victor had inherited anything. Agreements about territory, about debts forgiven in exchange for silence, about favors owed that had never once been called in. Victor didn't know these agreements existed. Elena was certain of that now, certain enough to feel the full weight of what she was holding. This wasn't leverage over Victor alone anymore. It was leverage over the men who made Victor's empire possible. Victor sent Marco 3 days later. Marco arrived expecting a confrontation, or at least the theater of one a woman defending a house she had no real right to keep. Instead, Elena met him at the door herself, led him into the library without a word of challenge, and poured him coffee from a pot warming by the fire. In a room that no longer resembled the ruin he remembered handing her the keys to. "Victor sent you to ask if I intend to leave," she said, before he could find the right opening. "I don't." Marco studied her over the cup he hadn't yet touched. The last time he'd seen her this close, she'd been standing at a gate with an iron key in her palm, saying thank you in a voice that gave nothing away. Nothing about her had changed in the way that mattered. She still gave nothing away. Everything around her had. "Tell Victor the house is occupied," Elena said. "He can visit any time he likes." As a guest, Marco understood. Sitting there with untouched coffee in a library that smelled of wood smoke instead of rot. That she was no longer asking Victor's permission to exist. She hadn't been for some time. He drove back to the city in silence and delivered the message exactly as she'd given it. Victor didn't answer right away. He turned it over the way he turned over everything, looking for the angle that made it make sense. "Is she afraid?" he finally asked. "No," Marco said. A pause settled between them, longer than either of them wanted it to be. "That's the problem," Marco said. Victor did not accept "that's the problem" as an answer. He accepted it as a challenge. Over the following weeks, he tested her the way he tested anything he couldn't yet explain. Indirectly, patiently, through people who wouldn't be traced back to him if things went badly. A supplier accidentally delayed a shipment of building materials Nico had ordered for the estate. A city clerk suddenly found reasons to question the paperwork on Elena's property. A man who'd once done small jobs for Victor showed up at the gates one afternoon, friendly, asking too many questions about who came and went. Elena greeted each of them by name before they'd finished introducing themselves. That was the part that unsettled them most. Not any threat she made, because she made none. It was that every single person Victor sent arrived to find Elena already expecting them, already aware of who'd sent them and why, as if the house itself had passed the news ahead. It hadn't. It was simpler and more unnerving than that. Sophia tracking filings, Raphael watching the roads, Nico's contacts in the port passing word before the visitors had even left the city. But no one outside the estate knew that. And Elena had learned by now that what people didn't understand, they filled in with fear. The Black House's name grew heavier with every failed test. Elena, for her part, had stopped thinking of Victor as a wall to be broken down. She'd realized somewhere in the underground archive weeks ago was structure held together by trust he'd never had to earn. Inherited loyalty, assumed alliances. Men who answered to him because their fathers had answered to his father and nobody had ever questioned the arrangement. She didn't need to attack that structure. She only needed to loosen it. A quiet word to Sophia's old contact at the property registry, and a business partner of Victor's discovered an inconsistency in a land transfer that made him suddenly, uncharacteristically cautious about renewing their agreement. A single copied page from the underground ledgers, delivered anonymously to a man who thought his decades-old debt to the Romano family had long since been forgotten, and he stopped returning Victor's calls within the week. A corrupt official who'd built his career on the assumption that certain records no longer existed began, quietly and without explanation, distancing himself from every meeting Victor's name was attached to. Victor noticed the pattern before he understood its source. Men who had never once questioned him were suddenly asking careful questions of their own. Nothing had been threatened. Nothing had been taken by force. He was not being attacked. He was being unmade. One small piece of trust at a time, and there was no target he could point a gun at to make it stop. He sent Dante next. Dante didn't knock. He rarely did anywhere, and the mansion's restored front doors didn't intimidate him the way they seemed to intimidate everyone else Victor had sent. He walked the entrance hall, slowly taking in the cleaned portraits, the burning chandelier, the absence of any visible security beyond a mechanic wiping his hands on a rag by the stairs, and found Elena in the library exactly where Marco had found her weeks before. She didn't rise. She didn't offer him coffee either. She'd read him correctly before he'd said a word. "Victor wants me frightened," she said, "or he'd have sent someone louder." Dante said nothing, which was, for him, close to agreement. Elena slid a single folded page across the desk toward him, instead of answering the silence with more of her own. He read it without picking it up. His expression didn't change, but something in the room did, a stillness that hadn't been there a moment before. The page named an incident from years earlier, before Dante had become the man Victor trusted to make problems disappear quietly. It named a person he had once protected at real cost to himself, a debt he'd never spoken of to anyone in Victor's organization, one that could unravel exactly how far his loyalty to Victor actually extended if it ever became known to the wrong person. "I don't intend to use it," Elena said. "I only wanted you to understand that I could." Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and left the mansion the way he'd entered it. Without a word, without a threat carried out, without reporting back anything Victor would find useful except the fact that he had nothing to report. Word of that too found its way outward, and it did more for the Black House's reputation than anything Elena had said or done herself. People from outside Victor's world began arriving at the gates, not seeking protection this time, but seeking ground. Two rival factions who'd have shot each other on sight anywhere else in the city sat weeks apart at the same restored dining table Elena had first shared with a frightened accountant, because both of them had heard the same rule and trusted it enough to test it. No bloodshed inside the Black House. It was the only condition Elena ever imposed, and she enforced it the way she enforced everything, quietly, absolutely, without raising her voice. It gave the mansion something Victor's entire organization, built on fear of violence, had never managed to offer anyone, a place where violence simply didn't happen, which made it, strangely, the safest room in the city. Victor's fury, when it finally surfaced, wasn't loud. It rarely was. It showed itself instead in the way he stopped mentioning the estate casually and started mentioning it constantly, in the way his patience with Marco's careful updates grew thinner each week. "It's my house," he said one evening, more to himself than to Marco, standing at the window of his office with the city spread dark beneath him. "I gave it to her. It's mine to take back whenever I choose." Marco, who had learned exactly how far he could push and no further, said it anyway quietly. "You gave her the deed." Victor turned from the window. He understood in the silence that followed precisely what he'd handed away that evening at the gates. Not a courtesy, not a leash, but a legal, permanent, undeniable claim that made the mansion hers in every way that mattered, no matter how many men he sent to test it. Later that night, alone in his study, Victor pulled an old photograph from a drawer he rarely opened. His father, younger than Victor, was now standing in front of the same mansion, flanked by men whose sons and grandsons now sat at Victor's own table, drew his own salary, answered to his own name. He stared at it for a long time. For the first time since he'd handed Elena those keys, Victor Romano felt something closer to unease than anger. The slow, cold understanding that the house he'd given away to be rid of a problem might hold a history his own family had spent generations making sure he never saw. Victor put the photograph away before dawn, and by the time he sat down at his desk that morning, the unease of the night before had hardened into something more familiar to him. A decision. Whatever his father had buried beneath that mansion, Victor decided was his to uncover, not Elena Moretti's. She had taken his generosity, his mistake. He corrected himself now, and turned it into a weapon aimed back at the very foundation of his organization. Allies grown quiet. Officials distancing themselves. A woman with no army who somehow knew things Victor's own father had never told him. That wasn't a nuisance anymore. That was a threat that had outgrown the leash he'd thought he was tightening. He called Marco into the office that afternoon and gave the order plainly, the way he gave every order. We take it back. Records, house, all of it, tonight. Marco didn't argue. He'd learned in recent weeks exactly how far his arguments carried with Victor and had stopped wasting them. He simply asked how many men, and Victor told him, and by evening the plan had a shape. Marco, Dante, 6 others, 3 vehicles, moving on the estate after dark when the roads would be empty and whatever forces Elena had gathered would be least prepared to resist. Leo heard the plan second-hand, from one of the men assigned to it, delivered as ordinary business. Tonight, the Moretti place, bring what you'd bring for a hard entry, and felt something in his chest go very still. He had spent weeks driving out to that house in the dark, telling himself each time that it was information, nothing more, a debt he owed a woman who'd never once treated him as expendable. He understood now, standing in the hallway outside Victor's office, with his own assignment in hand, that the debt had become something larger than information, and that tonight would ask him to choose which side of his life he actually belonged to. He didn't call ahead. He didn't need to. He simply left before the convoy assembled, driving faster than he should have on roads he'd learned to know by feel, and arrived at the Black House with enough time to say 4 words before turning back toward the city to avoid being missed. Tonight. All of them. Elena thanked him and meant it and didn't ask him to stay. She had known this night would come since the first time Marco left her library with an untouched cup of coffee going cold behind him. She had simply not known which night, and now she did. She did not panic. Panic wasn't useful, and more than that, it wasn't necessary. The house had been preparing for exactly this since the first shelf was cleaned and the first gate rehung. Sophia moved the last of the sensitive documents to a place even Elena wouldn't name aloud. Raphael checked every road in and out of the estate one final time. Nico secured the generator and the gate mechanism both, quietly, without being asked twice. The handful of people sheltering inside the house gathered in the library, calm because Elena was calm, because she had told them from the beginning exactly what kind of house this was, and they had chosen to believe her. No violence inside these walls. Tonight, more than any night before it, that rule would be tested by the man who'd given her the house in the first place. Elena had no intention of breaking it to meet him. Her objective was not to survive a war. It was to make Victor understand, in a single night, that the war he thought he was starting had already been lost weeks ago. The convoy came just after midnight, headlights off for the last half mile, the way men move when they still believe surprise is on their side. The mansion, as they approached, was dark, every window black, no sign of the lights that had made the estate a legend in recent weeks. Dark enough that for one brief moment riding in the second car, Marco allowed himself to believe this might actually be as simple as Victor had promised. The gates stood open. The 3 vehicles rolled through onto the gravel drive, engines low, and it was only once the last car had cleared the gate posts that the gates began, slowly and without any visible hand touching them, to swing shut behind them. Then the house woke up. Light bloomed in the ground floor windows first, then the second floor, then the third, room by room, until the entire mansion stood illuminated against the black hillside like something that had never once pretended to be abandoned. The courtyard, dark a moment before, was suddenly lit bright enough to see every face in it. Victor stepped out of the lead car slowly, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt the specific discomfort of being seen before he was ready to be. Elena, he called toward the house, his voice carrying flat across the courtyard. Come out. She did. She appeared on the top step of the entrance, unhurried, dressed as though this were an ordinary evening rather than the night Victor had come to take everything from her, and descended 2 steps before stopping, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough to make him cross the remaining distance if he wanted anything closer. You gave me this house, she said, because you thought it would make me disappear. Victor said nothing. You should have asked what was buried beneath it. Marco felt it first. The specific, sinking recognition that whatever Victor had promised them tonight bore no resemblance to what was actually unfolding in front of him. There was no fear in the courtyard. Only Elena, standing calm on her own steps and her own light, in front of people who had chosen every one of them to be exactly where they were. Dante's eyes moved slowly across the lit windows, across the mansion's restored gates now sealed shut behind them, and understood with a professional certainty that they had walked without noticing, into ground Elena had prepared for this exact moment. His hand didn't move toward his weapon. There was nothing here for it to accomplish. Leo didn't wait for either of them to decide anything. He stepped away from the others, putting visible space between himself and the order he'd been given, and said quietly enough that only the men nearest him would hear it clearly, but loud enough that Victor could not pretend he hadn't. "I won't." Victor turned toward him slowly, and whatever he might have said died somewhere before it reached his mouth. He stood in the middle of his own convoy in a courtyard blazing with light he hadn't ordered behind gates that had closed without his permission, flanked by two men who no longer looked entirely certain whose side they were standing on. For the first time in his life, Victor Romano understood exactly what it felt like to be the one standing outside someone else's gates, waiting for permission he no longer had any way of demanding. Nobody moved for a long moment after Leo's refusal. The courtyard silent except for the low tick of cooling engines and the wind moving through the restored trees along the drive. It was Elena who finally broke it. "Come inside," she said to Victor. "You came for the records. I'll show them to you myself." He followed her because there was nothing else left to do. Not with his gates sealed behind him. Not with Marco standing motionless and Dante's weapon still holstered, and Leo already crossing the courtyard to stand near the house rather than the cars. Victor followed her through his own gift of a mansion like a guest in someone else's home, which he understood now was precisely what he'd become. The passage down felt longer than it had any right to be. Elena led him through the archive room he'd never seen. The ledgers, the meeting table, the shorthand entries he recognized within seconds as belonging to a language he'd spent his whole life speaking without ever learning its grammar. And finally to the crested door at the end of the passage, unlocked now standing open. Inside, on a single shelf, sat a smaller collection than the rest of the archive. Newer, personal. Elena lifted the topmost file and held it out to him rather than reading it aloud herself. She had decided, standing in that basement hours earlier while the crew waited to arrive above, that this part wasn't hers to narrate. Victor read it in silence. It was his father's handwriting. Unmistakable. The same careful, economical script Victor remembered from birthday cards and the margins of old ledgers upstairs in the house he'd grown up in. Pages of it dated across the final 2 years of his father's life, outlining plans Victor had never once been told about, a slow, deliberate unwinding of the family's most violent holdings alliances his father had intended to sever. An organization his father had come to believe had grown so dependent on fear that it had forgotten how to survive any other way. "We built something that eats its own children eventually." One page read in his father's hand. "I would rather leave my son less than leave him this." Victor's composure, which had survived every test Elena had put in front of him for weeks. The rumors, the unraveling alliances, Dante's silent refusal in the library, even the gates closing behind him tonight, did not survive this. His hand, holding the page, was not entirely steady. "He never told me," Victor said, and his voice had lost the flatness it always carried, replaced by something rawer that he clearly hadn't expected to hear from himself. 30 years, and he never once. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. "Dale de Mouf." Elena watched him understand in real time that the mansion he'd given away to be rid of a problem had been holding underground in the one room even he'd never been to enter. The truth about the one man whose approval he had spent his entire adult life quietly, desperately trying to earn. "I don't want your empire," Elena said, once he'd set the page down. "I never did. I don't want your title, or your men, or a seat at whatever table you think I'm trying to build." Victor looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he's finally admitted he can't solve. "Then what do you want?" "The same thing your father wanted, at the end, apparently." She said it without cruelty, but without softening it either. "The freedom to decide who controls my life. That's all this house has ever given me. Not power over you, just the right to stop asking anyone's permission to exist." It was, she understood, the one thing Victor's entire world had never offered anybody. Not the men who served him, not the officials he paid, not even, it seemed, his own father in the years before his death. Everyone in Victor's world answered to someone. Elena had built the one room in the city that answered to no one at all. Upstairs in the courtyard, Marco made his own decision without needing Victor present to make it. "I'm not helping you burn this place down," he told Dante, quietly, watching the mansion's lit windows rather than the man beside him. He gave her the house. Signed, legal, done. Whatever's down there now, that's hers. He can't take back what she built out of what he threw away. Dante didn't argue. He simply stepped back from the vehicles, away from whatever the original plan had called for, and made it clear without a single word that he wouldn't be the hand carrying out an order he no longer believed Victor could win. Neither man became Elena's soldier that night. Neither of them needed to. They simply stopped being victors. When Victor and Elena were finally alone in the archive room, the ledger from the crested shelf still open between them, he asked her the question that had clearly been sitting under everything else for weeks. Why did you never fear me? Everyone fears me. Elena considered the question honestly before answering it. Fear only works on someone who has something left to lose, she said. By the time you handed me those keys, I'd already lost everything that used to matter. My father, my old life, any version of safety that depended on staying quiet and small. She glanced around the room, at the shelves, at the ledgers, at the house settling quietly above them. This place gave me something back. You can't threaten someone with losing a life they've already decided isn't worth protecting the way you think it should be. Victor had no answer for that. There wasn't one. Elena closed the ledger and set it flat on the table between them, her hand resting on its cover for a moment before she stepped back. You came here to take my house, she said. She let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to. You should have come prepared to lose your empire. Victor stood in the lamplight of the archive room for a long moment after Elena spoke, the ledger still open between them, his father's handwriting still visible on the page beside it. There's a choice in front of you, Elena said, when it was clear he wasn't going to speak first. You can walk out of this house and keep ruling exactly the way you always have, and live with the fact that everything down here still exists, still tells the truth about your alliances, and could surface the moment it stops being convenient for me to stay quiet. Or you can walk out and leave the Black House alone. Let it stand. Let me stay independent. She held his eyes. Those are the only two versions of tonight that end with you still having something left to protect. Victor understood, standing there, that killing her had stopped being an option somewhere in the last several weeks, without his ever quite noticing the moment it happened. It wouldn't undo what Marco knew now, or what Dante had already refused to do, or what dozens of quiet, ordinary people across the city had started to believe about a house that used to be a joke. Killing Elena wouldn't restore anything. It would only prove finally and publicly that he'd lost control of exactly the thing he'd built his entire reputation on, never losing. He looked at the ledger one more time, at his father's careful handwriting, at the two men waiting for him in a courtyard he no longer commanded. He said nothing else. There was nothing left that would change the outcome. He walked out through the same gates he'd once brought her through, expecting her to vanish quietly into a ruin he'd never intend to think about again. This time, the gates opened for him without ceremony, without triumph on Elena's part, without anyone stopping him at the threshold to make a point of it. Marco and Dante followed a few steps behind, neither of them looking back at the mansion the way men look back at something they've conquered. Leo didn't follow at all. The convoy pulled away down the service road into the dark, and for the first time since he'd handed a stranger a key and called it mercy. Fighter Romano left a place without having decided a single thing that happened inside it. The reversal, complete now in every way that mattered, needed no further words to mark it. In the months that followed, the mansion settled into a shape that no longer resembled either the ruin Victor had abandoned or the fortress it had briefly become to survive his siege. It became, instead, something the city had no established word for. People who needed somewhere to disappear from danger they hadn't caused learned, through channels no one could quite trace back to a source, that the Black House would take them in. Rival factions who might once have settled disputes in blood learned that the estate's single rule held, without exception, for anyone who walked through its gates. Elena never asked for loyalty in exchange for shelter. She never built the kind of hierarchy Victor had spent his life defending. She remained deliberately outside the entire architecture of power the city had always assumed was the only kind worth having. She had become something the old rules didn't have a category for. Independent, protected, and answerable to no one. Not through force, but because enough people had decided, one at a time, that the alternative was worse. The library, when Elena stood in it now, bore almost no resemblance to the cold, dust-choked room she'd first slept in with a fire built from twigs gathered outside. The shelves were full again, not with the coded ledgers which lived somewhere safer now, But with books she'd chosen her self-restored furniture worn soft with actual use. A fire that burned every evening whether or not she needed the light. On the mantelpiece, in a small dish that had once held nothing at all, sat a single iron key. She kept it there on purpose. She remembered exactly the weight of it, the evening Victor had pressed it into her palm at the gates, the particular coldness of his generosity, the way he'd turned and driven away certain he'd solved a problem forever. At the time, the key had meant exile, a sentence dressed up as a courtesy, a way of making a dangerous woman disappear without the mess of killing her. It meant something else now, sitting quietly on the mantel where she could see it every evening from her chair. It meant the exact moment she'd stopped being someone else's problem to manage and started being her own. Leo stayed, not as anyone's soldier, not as staff, not quite as anything the old world had a title for, simply as one of the people who'd helped build what the mansion had become. Present most evenings in the library or the courtyard, easy, in a way he'd never once been easy inside Victor's organization. Whatever existed between him and Elena remained, by unspoken agreement, exactly where it had always lived. Quiet, patient, built on trust rather than declaration, needing no further name. One evening, watching the fire, he mentioned that the city still talked about the house in whispers, that people still slowed their cars on the service road out of some instinct they couldn't fully explain. "Good," Elena said. He glanced at her, waiting. "They should be afraid," she said, "of what happens when people have nowhere left to run." The legend, by then, had long since outgrown the truth that built it. Criminals traded rumors about tunnels running clear to the harbor. Businessmen who'd never once set foot near the estate lowered their voices instinctively whenever Elena's name came up in a meeting. People who'd laughed at the ruin for a decade now refused to drive past its gates after dark, telling themselves it was superstition and half believing it anyway. Some swore Elena Moretti kept every secret anyone had ever confessed inside those walls, filed away and waiting. Some said Victor Romano still dreamed about the house some nights, the same gates, the same key, a decision he'd give anything to make differently. None of it was entirely accurate, and Elena, as always, let every word of it stand. The truth was simpler than the legend, and more permanent. The mansion wasn't feared because of tunnels that didn't exist or secrets that couldn't be proven. It was feared because it was the one place left in the city where Victor Romano's name no longer opened a single door. The gates stood quiet beneath a clear night sky, restored iron holding steady against the dark the way it had held for months now. Every window of the mansion glowed warm and gold against the hillside, a house that had once been a punchline, now visible for miles, unmistakable, unafraid of being seen. In the upper library, Elena stood at the window, looking out over the distant lights of the city that had once decided she was easiest to discard. The key rested on the desk behind her, exactly where she'd left it. Victor Romano had given Elena Moretti the abandoned mansion to be rid of her. He never understood that some prisons only need the right prisoner to become a kingdom. Elena Moretti turned exile into a kingdom, and Victor Romano learned it the hard way. If this story kept you hooked till the last line, comment "Black House forever" and tell us which chapter hit hardest. Follow for the next story. Another empire is about to meet its downfall.